Thank you for coming today to this Human Rights in Practice event, Finance and Human Rights. Before we get started, a couple of introductions. I'm Professor Larry Helfer. I co-direct the Center on International and Comparative Law, which is one of several co-sponsors of this event. And I'm really delighted to be hosting it. Also on behalf of our sponsors, including the International Human Rights Clinic, the Duke Center, the Human Rights Center at the Franklin Institute, the Business Law Society, the Human Rights Law Society, and the International Law Society. So thank you to all of our student groups. We have two really interesting and very well-qualified speakers on this particular topic about finance and human rights, and I'll introduce them briefly. Then each of them will speak for about 15 minutes or so, and we have a great turnout, so I'm certainly eager, and I know they will be, to hear your comments and questions. Technology seems to be cooperating, so assuming that works well. So let me start by saying Kindra Mohr leads the financial services and human rights practice of BSR, whose mission is to work with business to create a just and sustainable world. As a business and human rights attorney, Kindra advises financial institutions and their corporate clients and investees on innovative solutions to prevent and address human rights risks and adverse impacts. Previously, Kindra worked for the International Finance Corporation and supported clients to integrate best practices into their corporate governance frameworks. She also served as policy director for a global nonprofit, in which capacity she filed cases and advocated for communities for environmental and human rights protections and access to remedy in international finance and impact investing relating to human rights. Our second speaker, Amol Mehra, is a recognized leader in the field of business and human rights, and he currently serves as the Director of Industry Programs at the Laudes Foundation. In that role, Amol oversees global programs and teams to deploy philanthropic funding across various environments and industries, including fashion, finance, and labor rights, to inspire and to challenge industry to transition to a green, fair, and inclusive economy. Previously, he served as managing director of the Freedom Fund, a leader in the global movement to end modern slavery, and also as the executive director of the International Corporate Accountability Roundtable, a leading human rights organization harnessing the collective power of organizations to push governments to create and enforce rules over corporate human rights and responsibility. So each of our speakers, again, as I said, will say some remarks for about 15 minutes or so. That should leave us plenty of time for Q&A, and there's a lot of interesting stuff here. I see some of my own students who have had a taste of this when we talked about corporate responsibility in my international law course. If you've taken human rights with me, you would have touched on this as well. But now we get to do a deep dive, and I'm really excited to learn more. So over to Kindra.
Thank you so much, Larry, and to Duke and everyone here for showing up. All the people that made this possible. It's really great to be here and an honor to be able to speak with you all. Also, a great pleasure to have the chance to connect with my good colleague Amol. I worked with him in previous roles in our human rights journey together. So would love just to get started with setting the context. When we talk about finance and human rights, it's really a very big topic, covers a lot of different concepts, a lot of different human rights issues. And the financial sector, like many other sectors, consists of many different actors, everything from commercial banks and insurance companies to rating agencies, private equity, venture capital, fintech, the list goes on. So when I was talking to folks here about speaking about finance and human rights, I just wanted to step back a little bit and share that ecosystem that we're talking about and thinking about human rights and advocacy for accountability across those different actors might mean different things, and you may need to employ different tactics in order to see the results that you're looking for, meaning respect for human rights within the sector more broadly. So with that, turning a bit to the human rights issues that we see within finance, they're also quite broad. They're almost unlimited. So if you think about financial services operations, their own employees, their own supply chains, but also their downstream value chains, their investment chains, who they lend to, where they're invested, who are they underwriting, what kinds of projects are they financing, and where. And thinking through that, you start to see a wide range of issues, from privacy, land grabs, land rights, indigenous peoples issues, discrimination, and the list goes on. So with that, when you think about, okay, we've got a really big sector, we've got a lot of issues to tackle, what's a framework for even thinking about how to address these? And in my work at BSR, and as Amol may reference as well, we really look to the gold standard of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. In absence of a more robust regulatory framework to cover all of the issues that I just mentioned, plus all of the actors that I just mentioned. And the UNGPs, or the UN Guiding Principles, really are the North Star, if you will, on business respect for human rights. And they set out those principles and criteria that companies are supposed to adopt in order to respect human rights within their own operations in that broader value chain. It's not an easy thing to do by any means, but to get there in using advocacy tools, there are many different options. And what I think we have found, I'll speak for myself here, but BSR broadly, is that a mix of tools and advocacy avenues really will push the sector forward in a slow, but it is happening. So everything from strategic litigation to sign-on letters from civil society, to national contact point specific instance cases, to shareholder resolutions, pressures from employees internally, as well as shareholders themselves. So a lot of different actors and tools at hand to be able to move the sector. And as I mentioned, things are starting to happen. That's why I have the role that I have today. I certainly wouldn't have seen it 5-10 years ago, but starting to see commercial, private sector entities really moving ahead, taking human rights more seriously. I guess the last piece that I'll mention before turning it over to Amol is just that the big piece that seems to be missing is regulation. And you see some industries, banking, insurance, heavily regulated, but not necessarily in terms of human rights performance. So all of those advocacy tools together, while they can be effective, pushing those towards public policy and action within the legislature and regulatory environments across the globe really will be, I think, the primary catalyst for real change. I mean, there's nothing that corporations pay attention to more generally is the regulatory environment and compliance with it. They don't want fines. They don't want lawsuits. And so as we get to that, and we are starting to see developments, particularly in Europe, to move that ahead, I think it's a bit all hands on deck across different advocacy groups and in those tools that I mentioned. But would love to hear what Amol has to say about that and his reflections as well.
Great. I noted down a bunch of different things, so we can certainly talk more. Amol, can I turn things over to you for about up to 15 minutes or so?
Yeah.
And we can go back and
Sure.
forth. Great. Okay. Take it away.
Fantastic. Hey, yeah, and thanks so much for the invitation. I'm so sorry I couldn't be there with you all in person, but I'm glad to see what brings me back to my law school time, sort of rings of people sitting as far back as they can from the dais at the front. But so things haven't changed since I was in law school, but I appreciate all of you being in the room, and I'm so excited about the dialogue we'll be having. I'd also like to credit the organizers for putting this topic together and inviting an expert like Kindra and a funder like me into the room to be able to share our perspectives. Let me give you a bit of a background on where I situate in this landscape. I'm currently sitting in Loudest Foundation, which is a major human rights climate funder. We're based in Europe, in Amsterdam, London, and Switzerland, but we fund globally, and we fund across a range of issues because we are increasingly seeing the interconnection of climate and rights as core aspects of an agenda that needs much more support. We fund think tanks, nonprofits. We also fund civil society groups, as well as business groups that are seeking to move business. BSR is one of our partners. And what I want to also acknowledge is that the topic of human rights, I fear, is increasingly dropping down the political and practical, let's say, sort of agendas. And what I mean by that is, as there has been an increased focus on the agenda for decarbonization and the need to shift into climate action, I feel like we've sort of lost the script a bit on the human rights agenda. And I think that's for a number of reasons that are important for this conversation. One, human rights are hard. It's hard to wrap corporates' head around the whole spectrum of human rights. And also the way we framed up our human rights architecture and their indivisibility and their interconnections mean that it's not sort of a black and white target like decarbonization or a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. It's messy. Corporations and particularly financial institutions can find themselves impacting a range of human rights through a range of their activities. And I think Kindra did a good job of laying some of that complexity out. Under the architecture of the UN Guiding Principles, it proposes that these sort of three ways that any institution can be linked to a rights issue. They can cause that issue, let's say directly impacting a human rights issue. They can contribute to that issue, let's say through a sourcing model or a supply chain model, or they can be directly linked. And this is where the financial institution comes under more of the scope of work on the business and human rights architecture. By providing financial financing, lending, etc., financial institutions themselves have a responsibility under the guiding principles to engage in practices like human rights due diligence and provide remedy. This is also contested space because the question around how much contribution, how much of that investment would trigger that responsibility has been fought over for many, many years now. I think we're increasingly seeing consensus be established, and Kindra also mentioned some of the regulation that's in place now through regulations in the EU called the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive and the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the CSDDD and the CSRD respectively, kind of embed that there is this now legal obligation to conduct due diligence for companies of a certain size. There has been some pushback about the financial sector's inclusion, but over time, this will cover that sector as well. So all this to say, some of that messiness around how companies and financial institutions should look at human rights is getting more clarity, but it doesn't mean it's easy. And I think there's a couple of ways that we've seen, I'll give you some examples of ways that we've seen financial institutions or finance generally approaching and engaging on the human rights agenda. One is when we think increasingly about the roles of asset owners. These are the individuals or institutions that hold and manage assets like pension funds, insurance companies, sovereign wealth funds. We've seen some really innovative approaches coming up, and Kindra can probably speak to these because she's actively guiding some of her network on them. But I'll give you an example. The Dutch bank, ABN AMRO, has a really clear and strict human rights due diligence policy for its financing clients. So it requires that companies demonstrate adherence to core labor standards and human rights conventions before being able to access loans and credits. So what they're really trying to do is, as a risk mitigation measure, prevent their own financing activities from funding human rights abuses across sectors. So you see their real kind of linkage of how human rights can be built into a financing decision. At the same time, you're also seeing the emergence and probably the uptake of some stewardship roles for asset managers. These are the people that manage the assets on behalf of the owners. Here, there are many different initiatives underway where asset managers are increasingly asking investee companies or portfolio companies to disclose labor practices, to implement better working conditions, etc. And in some cases, they're actively filing shareholder resolutions to call for increased reporting. This takes us to the idea of shareholders. Each one of us has power over the companies we invest in. And many organizations, including Friends of Kindra and mine, and ours at groups like As You Sow, are really active in this shareholder proposal context. So in the case of modern slavery, I'll give you that one example. As You Sow has been really leading edge. What they've done is filed a number of shareholder proposals, including to public companies, sort of asking for action or reporting on issues like modern slavery. In one case, shareholder proposal was submitted to Tesla, I think in 2023, asking for Tesla to describe how it plans to eradicate child labor and forced labor from its supply chains. As you know, Tesla sources minerals that have often been linked to some human rights abuses. So you're seeing shareholder activation as well. The other area that I think is super nascent, perhaps developing more, is around blended finance. I've now participated in a number of blended finance oversight sort of regimes. One is this initiative called the SDG Impact Fund. Now, as you know, the Sustainable Development Goals are these sort of big, lofty goals, but we're now starting to see finance move and the unlock of public and philanthropic funding to sort of crowd in private financing. It's a really interesting area, and I think it holds a lot of promise for how finance can be leveraged towards human rights outcomes, not just looking at how finance can be regulated to prevent these outcomes. So again, these are just some of the ways that we're seeing finance show up in this space. I'm really keen to open this up for dialogue and discussion because I really do think this is the future of the business and human rights space and an area that still needs much more work and development. So I'd be keen to get your thoughts and ideas as well. I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you so much, Amol. That was a huge amount packed into a short amount of time. I'm going to just take the moderator's privilege to ask one question since we have a bit of time, to invite you to clarify both of the speakers a bit more on particular points. One of the challenges of this area is that, one of the potential upsides is also one of the challenges, I should say, and that is that there are so many different initiatives that are being proposed. There are also shareholder activism, as Amol, you described. There's regulation, in particular in the European Union, coming online. There's litigation against individual companies, which then I would assume would give more weight behind asset owners, such as the Dutch bank that you were describing, being able to require certain standards of those to whom they lend. So I just invite both of you as in your respective spaces to say more about how you think about your own roles in situations where the pressure points for moving the ball forward on finance and human rights and business and human rights more generally, there are many different avenues that you could pursue or different initiatives that you have to keep tabs on and understand how they intersect. So it's a complicated space, it's a rapidly evolving space, and so I maybe just invite first Kindra and then Amol to reflect a bit on that, just to give us a little more context, and then we'll open it up to questions from everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Larry. That's a great question because we hear that a lot from our clients, that there are just so many standards, regulatory developments. What do we keep track of? How do we know, what's the most important thing, which actions we need to take first? So we face this question on a day-to-day basis. It's very much a part of the work. And I think in one way that the answer is tying back to the UN guiding principles as that foundation, to be able to lean into that and say, if you are putting the processes and practices in place to align with the UNGPs, usually, not always, but usually you'll be fine, right? You'll cover your bases on many other aspects of standards that are arising on a fairly regular basis. So that said, maybe that's just a a general answer. I guess the more interesting aspect of the work, I think, comes when we have different clients from different areas of finance coming to us and saying, where do we even start? And, we really care about this aspect or our supply chain or our value chain, our investments in this region of the world or in tech in particular. And that really allows us to dig in and sort of, push aside some of the noise and say, okay, well, first we need to understand, what that portfolio might look like, where those risks may be, and identify them, help the company prioritize what might be the most salient human rights issues in front of them, and take action to address them in a more proactive way. So without even having that baseline of knowledge of, it's almost like, okay, we have the frameworks and there's a lot of different standards coming, and of course you need to comply with them, but getting into the actual day-to-day, looking at the human rights issues on the ground requires just putting away sort of that compliance hat and getting your hands dirty with those issues and understanding where they are, what business models may be creating higher risks than others, what geographies may present different risks that other geographies don't have. Industries, it's the same. And layering those on top of each other to really pull out from those portfolios, from those either lending or investments, to understand and be able to tackle the issues in a more systematic way. So it doesn't necessarily make them feel better to have that undertaking in front of them, but I think it helps to sort of cut through that noise of every day a new standard is coming out, and putting these different pieces together so that they see, okay, we've got a program in place that's very proactive, and we're ready to align with a number of different standards because we're already thinking about alignment with the UN guiding principles. So I don't know, Amol, if you have different reflections on that, but would love to hear.
Please.
I think that's really well summarized, Kindra. I mean, I think there's something else that I find very interesting about what's happening in the space, which is that the predominant narrative has been one about financial materiality. And this is the narrative that's won the day in the corporate sector as well as with financial institutions, that unless issues are financially material, then they're not of concern to investors or shareholders of the company. And that has been largely reflected in securities laws in the US. What's so interesting about the CSDDD and the CSRD is it expands that notion to include this idea of double materiality, that it's not just about the financial materiality, but it's also about sort of that risk to the people and climate around you. And that is also of material concern and should be therefore acted upon. So I think in the sea of regulations and standards that are out there, actually a seismic shift has happened, in Europe at least, around the concept of how to measure what matters. I'm going to be interested to see, and I doubt this will ever happen, that the US sort of regime will move in that direction. But what also helps is by complying with standards in the EU that have a double materiality lens, in a way corporates that want access to those markets or in those markets are already expanding the aperture of how they see rights as relevant to their business or not. So I think that kind of plays into, it's sort of above the standard, but as a more seismic mind shift.
Great. I have more questions, but I'm going to refrain from asking them. So please, if anyone in the audience has some ideas to get started. Yes, sir, in the back.
Yeah, so just on that, two questions just on that. One, what are the type of factors that you're considering in terms of looking at return on their investment for, investing in human rights? And then secondly, when I think of human rights and finance, I typically think of, US aid, IMF, World Bank, which are probably predominantly, international and public institutions. And they typically have, or traditionally have not led to a greater benefit to society in a lot of developing countries and a lot of even destabilize a lot of those economies. So now that there's an increase in private actors, do you think that leads to a more responsible framework for human rights compliance, and why?
Great. Why don't we, are there other questions? We could also take them in panels. Depends on how many of you there are. Yes, all the way in the back, please.
Yeah, I guess I just have a general question about how you guys view engagement versus divestment, especially for the smaller impact funds that might not have a lot of power, but then at the same time, a lot of bigger banks and asset managers often run into or say that they run into a lot of like legal issues and legal risk with engagement. So I'm curious on your take as to that.
Why don't we take those two and then we'll take another round afterward.
Sure.
Kendra, do you want to get started?
Happy to. That great, excellent questions. On the ROIs discussion, I think it really just depends on the type of financial institution. I mean, some impact investors, for example, may be more aligned with, supposedly a lower ROI while still doing good, doing well, doing good. Although there is research to suggest that maybe they aren't taking the hit on our ROI as some might suggest in order to have a social benefit. But we see a range, certainly. Like there are some financial institutions that will just plain, like if it's not about the return, that's primary. Alpha's primary, and that's, like everything else is just considerations, and if it does pose the financial materiality, the material risk that Amol was suggesting, then maybe it'll sway their decision to invest or divest. So I think we're seeing just a lot of different viewpoints from different investors, including where they are placed. European asset managers and asset owners tend to, generally speaking, a little bit more progressive in terms of human rights than in other places, but not always. So taking that with a grain of salt. On the development finance piece, 100% agree with you that there have been, and Amol knows this from our prior days of working in that space and knowing that, there have been significant harms done associated with that sort of financing and development work. So it's been a very interesting time to see the commercial private sector in finance pushing ahead beyond what the traditional development finance institutions have been willing to do, in part because their shareholders are countries, not necessarily private investors. So that gives the commercial sector, private sector finance a bit more room, so to speak. So it's a bit of a push and pull. I think there's more to see there, but I certainly hope you're right that there will be more of a sea change or greater progress across the entire sector, development finance, project finance included. So that hopefully I touched on those questions and answers for you. I guess on the investment and divestment piece, and then we'll turn it to you, Amol. I mean, the rule of thumb, and as the UNGPs describe and other standards will reiterate, I mean, the idea is to engage as your first option. Like divestment's the last resort. There are so many other issues that go into divestment. Responsibly divesting requires an assessment of what those human rights risks and impacts might be if you leave. So it's not just a matter of exiting the relationship. It tends to be a very complicated situation, but we always work with our clients to engage, to try to improve the human rights practices of the borrower or the investee, to ensure that they are either practicing better due diligence to prevent harm or addressing harmful impacts that they may have caused, contributed to, or are directly linked to. So that means working with them throughout that remedial action remedy stage. But engagement generally is the way to go if at all possible, with the exiting as the last resort.
Amol, were you able to hear the questions?
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely, I
What are
was.
your-
But I think Kindra really kind of hit them on the head again. I think, Kindra, it'd be so interesting to get your take, though, also on the trends towards engagement versus divestment. I really do think, at least I'm sensing, that the space for financial institutions to claim or to say that they're staying in an investment to support engagement towards shifting that investee company has kind of gained room. Whereas I think before it was sort of like, you got to get out if there's any sort of allegations or concerns about rights abuses. And I think that's an interesting shift. I think the guiding principles kind of helped us with that. But I also think there's perhaps a more real understanding of the leverage that financial institutions can provide when they actively use it. Is that just kind of, Kindra, to throw it back to you, perhaps? Is that like sort of how you're seeing it work with your member companies as well, that they're kind of leaning in to the tools of engagement?
I think so. Yeah, I think that's a great point, Amol, is just like thinking through how they can use leverage more effectively. And to be honest, I think it's even more complicated, say, when you have a private equity firm that has a majority stake in a company, has board seats. So divestment is it's really difficult. So, the point is to use what they have in place, their leadership, their ownership, to have downward pressure on the company. And exiting in those cases is just, it's almost off the table, I think. So I think it may just also depend on where you're, like banks versus private equity, for example, is just a reflection point on that aspect. But yeah, definitely. I remember the days of, well, you have to get out. You just have to exit. There's no question.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Great. More questions from anyone on, yes, sir.
So these big corporations, like, they eat complex problems all the time for lunch, right? And the way they do it is by throwing their best and brightest on it, or they're hiring in the best and brightest, giving them fat budgets so that shortage of resources is never the thing that keeps them from solving that problem. And so I'm curious, are you seeing these companies investing in solving these problems at their full capability, full wherewithal? Or are they holding back at all? And like the way they would on other problems, right? And if not, is there a concern that, saying, hey, this is just really complex, is giving them a bit of a pass for underinvesting in solving these problems?
Great question.
That's
Any other, take maybe one more if there is one, whether it's the same or someone else? All right, we'll take that one because that's I think I like that one, and then I have a follow-up as well. So, Amol, why don't you get started on that?
Yeah, I love that question, and it's very thoughtful and also very attuned to the pulse of the moment. Obviously, we're seeing a huge pushback in the US on ESG, and I think the consequences of that play out across companies' internal organization and structure as well. In fact, last week I spent all week in New York at New York Climate Week, which is both exhausting and kind of terrifying, at least this year, because I really sensed the retrenchment from the corporate sector. Kindra, I'd be keen to get your take too, but a lot of folks sort of saying we went too far too fast, that now challenging to moving beyond carbon to look at social issues is too complex. The just transition agenda, which focuses on centering equity in the context of the decarbonization agenda, is so broad, yada, yada, yada. What that means, though, is that internally corporations, at least I'm sensing from their sustainability departments, are losing political space. So that means that the issue has sort of dropped on the C-suite agenda, and that just enables much more retrenchment. So even with this notion that corporations can throw buckets of money at solving these problems, that is increasingly, I fear, not the case. And I think CSOs, corporate sustainability officers, are finding it a tougher market right now. So I think we need to kind of win back the narrative on the rights agenda. I think the way to do that is to link it more strategically to the climate agenda, which is moving and has some kind of capture at the C-suite level. But that's a much bigger problem and challenge. But I don't know, Kindra, what your thoughts were on that.
Absolutely. I think you hit it perfectly, Amol, thinking through the budgets that the people we work with, they are they are definitely not getting the resources that they need. Absolutely not. And some of the teams that we work with it's one person. So they bring us in as sort of their like thought partner and their, back office support because they don't have the resources that they need. So I think tying the work more generally and broadly to climate, biodiversity as well, will only, bring forth different pressures, but I think more levers that we can pull. The excuse that these are complex problems and, we can't really take it all on, I'm just a bank, thinking through the fact that, these are complex problems that require like collective solutions. So there's no sitting on the sidelines, so to speak. So I think, like Amol said, changing that narrative and shifting it, hopefully we'll start to see a bit more of a shift towards more progress, maybe next year, Climate Week 2025.
So let me just jump in here. I want to ask Amol you about the EU corporate sustainability directives. And there are a couple of dimensions to this question. One is, I wonder whether, and this Kindra could be also for you as well, whether you're seeing a difference between companies that are headquartered and have their business primarily in the US as opposed to those that are in Europe. Now, obviously, they're going to have footprints elsewhere, many of them. But I'm curious whether there's a difference there. And part of that difference could relate to the directives as they're coming online. So there's been research by a number of scholars. Professor Anu Bradford is probably the leading one on this idea of the Brussels effect, that when the EU regulates for its, 27 now member states, because its market is large enough, if they put in place a kind of mandatory set of rules with respect to certain kinds of disclosures and due diligence and so forth, that any company that has any meaningful footprint within the European Union is going to need to adhere to that standard. And then as a result, for efficiency reasons and because most businesses really don't like having divergent regulations in their different parts of their supply chain or their various markets, that will become a de facto global standard. And I'm wondering if that story is too hopeful, or if these regulations are not really strong enough. I mean, I'm reminded of the ways in which when you're dealing with a complex problem, particularly one that's evolving very quickly in a regulatory, diverse regulatory landscape, that there's a possibility that some of the EU regulations, they take so long to negotiate, by the time they're out, they're a little bit outdated already. So I'm just curious if maybe, Amol, I'll start with you, what your thoughts are on whether this EU regulation is going to meaningfully shift the discussion and the way in which finance and human rights is addressed both within the EU and then eventually outside of it.
Yeah, I think this is the billions of dollar question, right? I mean, I think what we've certainly been supporting, we are perhaps the largest funder of efforts to build the CSDDD into practice and law, and now we're moving towards funding implementation of it at the EU member state level. I think that the theory holds, though. In fact, when I was in dialogue with many companies, global companies mostly, but also companies as part of European supply chains, this filter effect of what the Brussels kind of decision will have is substantial. So I think you're right in that companies who want to compete know that they must kind of comply, and then companies that want to be in the supply chain of those companies that are in scope are also increasingly ramping up in terms of how they're helping, let's say, transparency or show what they're putting in place in their supply chain operations. I'll give you an example. We fund quite a bit in Bangladesh, obviously one of the world's largest export economies for garment. Interestingly, the Bangladesh BGMEA, the Garment Manufacturers Association there, is well read and following the developments in the EU, because to compete in EU markets, to be in those supply chains, they know they need to get their factories up to snuff. So I think the trickle down effect is working. My worry with efforts like CSDDD and CSRD is if it just focuses on reporting, we are kind of losing here. And companies are already ramping up the hiring of reporting analysts, et cetera, or just for the disclosure. This is really about shifting business practice and business models. And I do worry that, again, if companies simply say that they can just report their way through it, we're kind of missing the script. But Kindra, I don't know what you think about that question, whether it sort of has this spillover effect.
I think you're right. I mean, we're hearing from members that are outside the EU that are not covered by CSDDD at all, and probably won't be for the foreseeable future, but are already planning, their medium to longer term sustainability efforts around alignment. And this is in the financial services space where it's the coverage of finance under the CSDDD is much more limited. I mean, there still is some downstream, rather upstream coverage of due diligence and human rights practices, but it's not the same as if you were, a manufacturer or something like that. There's a slight carve out. So I'm encouraged to see the conversation. I think these early days where it's still a bit cloudy and unsettled about exactly what CS alignment or compliance with CSDDD means gives us some space to push the guidance and the dialogue around it to say, no, this is what it means. This is what you have to do before, the legal teams inside can tell them, no, you don't have to do this. So working on that upfront actively, trying to spur good practices and put them in place. But we're hearing about it, requests to do assistance, support from Canadian members and those in the U.S. So it's a good sign, I think.
So maybe just one quick follow-up on that. Amol, if you're right that the reporting, you use the phrase they're reporting their way through it or thinking they can do that, does that affect, might that affect the Loudest Foundation's funding decisions in the following way, right? So the way in which reporting is supposed to work is there information that has been closely held, not public. When the information comes out, obviously it's going to be, corporate counsel is going to try to spin it to make it the most anodyne and kind of positive case that they can. But the entire point of that disclosure is to empower advocacy organizations and whether in the human rights space, the labor space, the environmental protection space, to then be able to say, actually, no, that's not true. What you have now said tells us that we have a problem, and here's what we're going to do about it. So the point that was raised earlier about the engagement versus divestment, if you're going to engage, you now have the basis for engaging in a more meaningful way, perhaps, but you've got to give some material resources to the engagement groups. So I'm wondering if you've given some thought about that from your the foundation's funding perspective.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and maybe I can just share about how we approach our funding in a more systems-oriented way, because I think it goes to this question. So when we engage in funding, let's say for a policy reform like CSDDD, we immediately think about what the echo chamber and ecosystem around it needs. So one is there needs to be some tools out there that help companies know what their supply chain is. And so we funded efforts like Open Supply Hub, which is the largest repository of public factory by factory information, let's say that affects the garment supply chain. But now some tech, the responsible, I think RBA is now in dialogue with them too, looking at how you can get tech material sort of disclosure. So that's like one, the information piece that enables the risk assessment done by companies. Then there is, as you say, the sort of advocacy, the work that goes to use that disclosure from companies in a way that shifts or helps engage the company in its activities. So there we're funding groups like the Shift Project, as I think you all know, and BSR, et cetera, to sort of sit with the companies to help them kind of navigate that terrain. And then you fund straight up some of the more hard-edged work, Business Human Rights Resource Center, the campaigners, the people that are going to take that disclosure and say, this isn't good enough, and we need to move this agenda. So I think by looking at it from what the company needs, what the ecosystem needs, and kind of funding into that, we can make this thing more meaningful than I think what we've seen in the past. Let's just give an example. I worked on conflict minerals regulation, which was part of the Dodd-Frank package, section 1502 of Dodd-Frank. To be quite honest, that sort of has lost steam, largely because there was no sustained infrastructure around accounting for how companies were disclosing. And so it just became a reporting burden on companies. That's my perspective. So I think we have to constantly think about feeding the ecosystem. And that's what I think is critical about how philanthropy approaches these problems.
Kindra, do you want to add anything? Should we take more questions?
Yeah, happy to take more questions. I think, Amol, I mean, in your perspective with the funding, it's certainly, there's a lot of efforts to support from the inside game to that outside, where you do have the heavy hitters, those that are the campaigners, and providing that broader ecosystem approach to the advocacy. So yeah, happy to hear from others.
Any further questions, things that you would hope that, you wish you would know, but now's your time to ask, or how you can get involved, or how it relates to something you've learned about in, business associations or international law? Doesn't really matter which. Yes, thanks.
Yeah, sorry, just sidetrack a little bit. I wanted to focus a little bit to Asia, because we've been talking a lot about Europe and Western countries, but when you talk about human rights standards, as someone who comes from an Asian country, I know for a fact that it seems highly unattainable for a lot of countries like India or Bangladesh or Sri Lanka. And all too often, these countries tend to be the hubs of manufacturing. And when you have supply chains that are so diverse right now, where you have certain products being the first assembly being done in, let's say, India, and next one being shipped out to Europe, how do you ensure that human rights is something that is adhered to? How do you ensure that reporting is consistent through all these supply chains, and the end result is a product that does meet these standards that are like set up in, let's say, the US or Europe? Because it is a costly affair to do these in, I'd say, in Eastern countries, because again, human rights tends to take a backseat over there, and advocacy might not be as strong. So, it's what does the future look like for with regards to this?
Amal, do you want to maybe get? Could you hear that?
Kick off.
Sure.
Yeah, I did. Thank you. And I think I appreciate that question. Obviously, for Loudest Foundation, Asia is a key market for us. Here's what I think we did to pivot and address the gap that you mentioned, is that by knowing where supply chain, let's just say kind of nodes are, where there are key leverage points within a sector, one can get a lot quicker and more efficient in shifting that sector's pathway towards human rights compliance, or the just transition, or climate and decarbonization. In manufacturing supply chains, it's very key and clear that suppliers are the missing middle. And so there has been an undercapacity of an investment in small and medium enterprises, and particularly suppliers. So I think what we're trying to do is to build the voice of and awareness of suppliers to kind of get ahead on these issues, and that's in country. I think that will then open up the supply chain, both upstream and downstream, to be able to kind of address it. I think there's another thing here that we just need to name, is the politicization of human rights. In places like India, it is increasingly challenging to use human rights language and framing in work. And so we have to be clear and clever about how we talk about these issues. So we've found that the just transition agenda, the climate and decarbonization agenda, is open space for collaboration with Indian multinationals, Indian domestic businesses, and Indian government. And so why not use that opportunity to also lift equity outcomes?
I'd love to jump onto that, if I may.
Please, of course.
Sure. I mean, from the financial services perspective, and definitely hear you on just different regions and different approaches, and the way to uplift human rights and the communities and workers that are doing the hard work there. What I fear, and in going and speaking with some financiers that are based in Asia but elsewhere, is is just the concept that human rights are subjective or they're relative, and hearing it from a corporation, like, well, we don't need to worry about that there. And I think that's, we push back on that quite hard. Yes, human rights are difficult to attain and to respect across all business operations in the value chain. However, pulling them back from that way of thinking, I think, is so critical, because it does come from different pressure points within the value chain. The financiers have to understand that they need to respect human rights throughout, their financial lending and investments. Like, that needs to be, it needs to be understood in their practices, and they need to put resources behind it. So, it's not popular, but saying, there is you can't cut corners on this. And, from the top down, from the financial flows down, but also, as Amol was saying, like, it has to come bottom up as well. Like, the people on the ground, the organizations doing the work that are living in these communities need to be empowered to take this into their own hands as well. So it needs to really come from pressures from different areas, because, it's very frustrating for us to have conversations with companies from financial institutions that say, that's a Western concept. People don't mind being discriminated against in this place, or they don't mind not, having a living wage elsewhere. Like, it's a very frustrating perspective to encounter. So we try very hard to disabuse them of that concept.
Other questions? Anyone else who has not asked a question before want to get on board? You're welcome to. No. Yes.
What would you say to such a corporation? Can you just do a kind of improvised talk back to them? What do you say? Pretend Larry's the corporation.
Well, Larry, I don't know if you've heard about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but no, usually it's a dialogue about, these are fundamentals. These countries have signed on to these treaties and conventions. Like, this isn't a concept that's just coming from BSR or from my own personal, ethics driving me to say these things. Like, this is something that has been decided upon and agreed upon by multiple governments over decades. Even you could go back to, the earliest days of, thinking through religious laws and so on and so forth across different religious entities. But, stemming it from some fundamental jurisprudence and conventions and so forth, it gives a bit of a, you could kind of see a light bulb go off, because they are then aware of, I didn't realize there was such a rich history here, and suggesting and explaining, like, these things apply across sectors. These are universal. They do not trump, one right doesn't trump another right, and these are aspects that we're all trying to achieve. I think adding on top of that there are also, it's a process, that these are steps that companies need to take, that there are due diligence and access to remedy principles that they need to adopt, that it's not going to be an overnight, you sign this declaration and therefore I've solved all of my human rights issues. So I think it's framing it in terms of, there is a foundation here, and proactively these are things you can do, and we know it's not going to be overnight, so giving them some solutions. It doesn't, they may not hire us again, but.
Well, maybe I can put in a bit of a pitch here, and I'm going to, just before I do, explain that I'm speaking in my personal capacity. I also serve as a member of the UN Human Rights Committee, and because we were talking about South Asia, India came before the committee just over the summer. First time in quite a few years. They sent a very high-level delegation, the Justice Minister, the Attorney General, the Solicitor General, the head of police, and they took the process very seriously. And they submitted a wealth of information. There were huge numbers of civil society reports on a variety of topics. And so to the extent that, you want to, and at the end of that process, the committee gives a series of observations and recommendations about India's human rights practices. This is in the civil and political rights space. So there is a very recent document that one could refer to and the countries, there are 174 states parties to the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So there's lots of current material. Yes, it has a long history, I think it's important to emphasize, but there's also current as well. This sort of pivots a little bit, though, to the point that maybe I'll just raise this rhetorically and then maybe give the speakers the last word. One of the initiatives to move into the space to think about corporations and human rights, when that was done by John Ruggie leading to the guiding principles on business and human rights, I hear what Amol is saying. We're in a different place than we were 12 or 15 years ago. It's a different political environment. It's a different business environment, I think, as well. And that was an opportunity that was very well utilized. But one of the challenges I've always thought is that the core structure of human rights, particularly at its origins, was about the relationship between government and individuals, or government and groups as well. And the move to human rights into the business and finance and corporate space has been a move that has required a number of conceptual shifts that are not always clear. Initially, I think corporations, the sort of response was, that's not my concern, that's a governmental concern. I think they're beyond that now, but I wonder whether, in the current environment, whether that kind of discourse of human rights in the corporate space is, if it is in fact, as Amol, you were saying, kind of dropping on the political and practical agenda, maybe you do want to, at least for some period of time, talk about the same concerns using different language. So I just wonder if that's what your thoughts are potentially on that, or, and I'm happy to give both of you the last word, because we've got about 3 or 4 minutes left. So Amol, why don't you take it, and then Kindra, you can close us out.
But I really love that as perhaps the most a thought provocation at the end of a panel like this, because I think there's a couple things. One is the jury, I fear, is still a little bit out. And what I mean by that is I think we have momentum established towards the internalization of rights respect as part of ordinary business. But what I'm fearful of is the broad scope of human rights can, I think, shift corporate attention and intention on these issues. And as the human rights architecture continues to evolve, let's just note last year the recognition to a right to a safe and healthy environment. We're seeing, rights being described around the rights of future generations, et cetera, et cetera. These sorts of concepts, and I'm not saying I disagree with them, because I've also watched politically what I say, but these sorts of concepts in the mind of a corporate executive are confusing, unclear, and massively expansive. So we have work to do within the human rights community to not dumb it down, but to really understand what is core to what we're talking about, and where do we want this human rights movement to go? Because the reality is corporations are increasingly filling the roles of states, and we need them to be onboarded into this agenda, which is a shift to the way I think you so accurately described the traditional human rights structure was built.
Great.
So maybe I'll just quickly say thank you as well here, because this is an incredibly important conversation. I'm so sorry I'm not in the room, but I encourage all of your students to continue their interest in this. There's so many jobs. I know many of you are job concerned. There's so many jobs developing in this area constantly. So I think even from a self-interest point of view, you should stay cued in.
Thank you so much, Amol. Kindra, over to you for a final word.
Thank you. Thank you, Amol, for that as well. I would just say on the language piece, it just fits so well into what we were talking about in terms of different tools that we can use for advocacy. And the language is a big part of that. So, whether it's, supporting shareholder resolutions that tackle issues of discrimination or of climate change, and, using different tools, different language to try to essentially attack some of the issues that we're seeing head on, in a very discreet and targeted way, can be a way to sort of break the door open, so to speak, and just start to see change and where we can catch momentum to build on the movement. I mean, we really have come quite a long way in a very short amount of time, I think, on the business respect for human rights. But there is, as Amol said, there's just so much more to do. So please, no matter where you go and what you do, just take these lessons with you on what businesses have a responsibility to do wherever you end up.
Wonderful. On that note, please join me in thanking both of our speakers. Thanks, Amol.